I came to this topic out of an interest in kind of, again, re-entering a conversation about the relationship between capital and race, or capitalism and racism. A lot of people today use the term racial capitalism, which came, I think, was a coinage of originally of Cedric Robinson in his book Black Marxism, although there may be other people who have used that term or variations on that term. But I don't necessarily think that that there's a strong theoretical grasp of these relationships within the Marxist tradition, and certainly in the non-Marxist tradition. There's a lot of writing about race that completely divorces the conversation from the history of capitalism. So, this is just to state some very obvious things. And so I want to start with just a few kind of basic propositions that I wrote down while I was coming over here. And then I was going to read just a very short excerpt from the chapter, which is not what I'm going to talk about tonight at Elliott Bay, so it's completely different, and I think maybe it'll give a little bit of a context for the conversation. So this is what I would say, and maybe these are propositions that will be sources of dispute and conversation. Capital is the name given to a kind of value making. Race is also the name given to a kind of value making. They're coeval projects that develop from the colonial and slave trading matrices of early capital accumulation. Racism is not the origin, but the toxic byproduct of these accumulation processes. And Barbara Fields has a famous line that I think Assad also quotes in his book, where she says, it's not the case that slavery was about the production of race. Slavery was about the production of tobacco, sugar, and cotton. But race and racism are one of the byproducts of slavery, and not just slavery, but colonialism and colonial projects of land dispossession and also colonization. Race and racism are conserved not as atavisms, pre-capitalist forms of ascription or identity or group differentiation, but as productive technologies of differentiation that are functional within the accumulation process going forward, and particularly functional to the resolution of its periodic crises. Okay? So in terms of thinking about the coevalness of the production of race and capital as forms of value making, then we have to start to think about how they become imbricated in history, in the unfolding of the crises of accumulation that are the history of capitalism. So those are my basic starting propositions. They're kind of abstract, but I think they're helpful for me because I guess I'm not so interested in an argument that tries to sort of resolve the chicken and the egg question. Is it racism? Is it capitalism? It's really both, but actually you have to talk about them as distinct things. So the tendency to want to subsume racism to a kind of aspect of capitalism, I think, doesn't necessarily serve our understanding that well, even though I think my own analysis probably shades a little bit in that direction. I'm also interested in, I think, what we might think of as the relatively autonomous history of racial formation, which is when I say relatively autonomous, I mean that it takes on a kind of life of its own. There are these forms of differentiation that now exist in the world, in the ways in which people understand themselves and their membership in groups, and in the built environment, and in our infrastructure, and in our modes of knowledge production, and in our ways of valuing human experience and human being, that are part of a long history. And that history is braided together with the history of capitalism. There is no period in the history of capitalism where there is not also racial domination. And there is no racial domination that is outside of the history of capitalism. So that just seems to be, to me, just a kind of elementary sort of starting point where we should be beginning the kind of conversation that the left should really center itself in and ground itself in. There's obviously a lot there's a lot of tendencies on the left that choose a kind of a Eurocentric kind of race-blind lineage, that relegate the conversation about race to a kind of epiphenomenon of class struggle. And there's obviously a lot of race-first, kind of race-focused kind of critique that imagines that there is a history of racism and racial formation that is somehow outside of capitalism, as if slavery wasn't about the production of sugar, tobacco, and cotton, right? So this is a dilemma. We see this dilemma all over the way in which we navigate the terrain of social movements today and in the past. So it's obviously a crucial issue for thinking about anti-capitalist politics. So that's the sort of background to what I was kind of grappling with, and probably have been grappling with for most of my sort of life as someone kind of trying to think about the world. So the chapter is it's just a chapter in this book, and it's in some ways I think maybe the departure point for another project that I want to do about racism and infrastructure, which I could talk about later. But it really was a kind of my attempt to re-enter into the text of Marx to kind of think about Marx's hesitancy, particularly in talking about slavery and colonialism. We can find many places within Marx's oeuvre to think about this question. I was looking primarily at Capital Volume 1, where Marx is talking about the working day and where Marx is talking about primitive accumulation. And so I just kind of went sort of into this work and tried to read it closely and tried to think about how is Marx talking about slavery? How is he talking about the relationship between the value form that he thinks of as the sort of modality of mature capitalism and what he calls the primitive sort of moment of accumulation. So I'm trying to work that out, and I'm trying to suggest that actually there is a hesitancy in Marx, that there isn't a resolution, that there isn't a kind of prior accumulation that he is sort of imagining as having been relegated into the past. And there isn't ultimately a mature capitalism that isn't always imbricated with the sort of primitive, dimensions of accumulation which foreground force and violence. So we can find, I think, not an answer to the question, but a similar framing of a kind of coevalness of these problems in Marx, even though, of course, Marx also shades towards an imagination that suggests that we're all heading towards a mature capitalism, which is, in fact, is obviously not really the case, although it's not the case either, right? It's not the case that capitalism doesn't develop, right? So that's kind of the sketch of the sort of thinking about the essay. The last thing I'll say by way of introduction is that the real point of entry for this, for me, was reading Frederick Douglass. So this is where the kind of archives of black radicalism come into the conversation, because I was reading Frederick Douglass and I was teaching the narrative, the first narrative, which Douglass published in 1845, and then it was just kind of dawning on me, of course, not a surprising kind of observation, that this is written right at the same time of the Communist Manifesto, right? So Douglass and Marx are contemporaries, and you could put images of both of their visages on the screen, and a lot of people probably wouldn't be able to tell them apart. There's a real sort of parallelism, and there's an interesting way, I think, that I started to think about what would it be like for Douglass and Marx to be in a conversation. Maybe someone's going to discover that there is some point of contact between Douglass and Marx. That I wasn't doing that kind of research. This is almost sort of more in the realm of a kind of intellectual, not an actual intellectual history, but actually a sort of a history of thought, right? So there's a passage in Douglass's narrative where he talks about being hired as a free carpenter while he's still a slave. Okay, and this is the passage, and I use it as the epigraph to this essay. So I'll just read the passage, and then I'll just read maybe 2 or 3 pages, very short, and then we can open it up for conversation, if that's okay. So this is Douglass. Many of the black carpenters were freemen. Things seemed to be going on very well. all at once the white carpenters knocked off, and as they said, would not work with free-colored workmen. Their reason for this, as alleged, was that if free-colored carpenters were encouraged, they would soon take the trade into their own hands, and poor white men would be thrown out of employment. My fellow apprentices very soon began to feel it degrading to them to work with me. They began to put on airs and talk about the niggers taking the country, saying we all ought to be killed. So, in this account, Douglas is describing black entry into an order of abstract equivalence defined by the wage relation, something that is understood by the whites that he is working alongside as a threat to their own wage-earning capacity. This threat is in turn narrated as a loss of country or sovereign capacity, which calls forth the fantasy of a war of extermination against the black worker. This moment in Douglas's text is interesting for the ways it illuminates race-making as a social, political, and affective process that eventually constitutes race as an irreducibly warlike relationship. Black and white, slave and free already exist as distinctions, but at first, Douglas tells us, the presence of the free-colored poses no special problem. What initiates the shift all at once? We might initially read the passage as confirming the conventional wisdom of theorists of racially segmented labor markets. However, in emphasizing that things seem to be going very well and noting white fears of potential black monopolization of the trade as mere allegation, Douglas is in fact doing more than establishing anti-black racism as a historically given condition that automatically reproduces itself. What is it about the mere presence of a black carpenter that threatens a total loss of livelihood? Why is the sense of threat so readily amplified and transferred to the thresholds of political identity and national subjectivity? Quote, niggers taking the country. Finally, how is the affect, fear, anger, translated into a genocidal impulse? We all ought to be killed. Put simply, how does the conjunction of race and labor become a conjunction of race and war? I suggest that race war, far from being an afterthought, in fact controls and mediates the entire sequence of events that Douglas describes. Indeed, one of the most striking aspects of Douglas's narrative is the way in which he consistently describes slavery as something other than the theft of black labor, emphasizing instead its violent, totalizing claims on black life. In explaining these events, Douglas intentionally highlights the double threat of wagelessness and political degradation that the considered presence of the black carpenter evokes. In turn, he depicts the production of race, in this case whiteness, as a process of binding juridical status and despotic power, keeping the country, putting on airs, and arrogating expansive extra-civil rights to kill. He defines all of this, moreover, in terms of a transition from slavery to capitalism. Generic whiteness is revealed as a specific relationship to blackness in its relationship to capital, one that seeks to banish the specter of wageless life evoked by both the prior association of blacks with slavery and actual conditions of market dependency. It is worth recalling in this context Du Bois's famous description of whiteness in Black Reconstruction as a, quote, public and psychological wage. The association of whiteness with wages through the monopolization of fields of employment has been widely discussed. Less fully examined has been how the elevation of whiteness to the threshold of nationality actively links freedom with the management of public authority, specific mechanisms of violence, and an operational notion of racial nemesis. I think maybe I should stop there with Douglas and then just say a couple of things that I sort of go on then to think about, to sort of return to an earlier argument in the essay where I'm suggesting how Douglas and Marx are actually both thinking in kind of pretty complicated ways about the relationship between being a wage earner and being a wageless worker. and that they're both thinking in complicated ways about differentiations within the field of the labor relation that produce what Marx calls competition among the workers. Competition among the workers that becomes divisive. So in both Douglas and Marx, what we find is a critical sense that the violence of proletarianization and market dependency in the transitions to capitalism is retained most directly in reference to slavery. And Marx is constantly talking about the enslavement of the worker. Sometimes he's talking about that metaphorically, like he's not saying it's actual enslavement. Sometimes he's comparing it to actual enslavement. And sometimes he's using slavery to kind of highlight a violence that is now concealed in the wage relation. Right? So there's interesting ways in which the kind of framework of slavery moves around in Marx's description of wage labor. But in both Marx and Douglas, you could say that slavery is being retained as a way of thinking about the transition to capitalism, as a kind of ongoing process, not as something that's being left behind. In 1855, Douglas observed, the slaveholders, with a craftiness peculiar to themselves, by encouraging the enmity of the poor laboring white man against the blacks, succeed in making said white man almost as much a slave as the black man himself. The white slave has taken from him by indirection what the black slave has taken from him directly and without ceremony. I think that's also a really interesting framing, right, of the relationship. In 1870, Marx elaborated on the antagonism of English towards Irish workers as, quote, artificial, kept alive, and intensified by the press, much as the same as that of the poor whites to the Negroes in the former slave states of the USA. As Du Bois would later argue, the real modern labor problem lies closer to the condition of racial dispossession than to the prospects of normative wage-earning stability. Capitalist freedoms and the enjoyment of them, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, in turn require us continuously to put on airs and to cultivate a generous rage against the prospect of a bare life. Atlantic slavery was the cornerstone of capitalist exploitation, appropriation, and dispossession over several centuries. It also bequeathed an enduring devaluation of black life. The production of race and class has depended on managing valuations and devaluations of black social and biological reproduction in the interests of capital accumulation and its social reproduction. From medical experimentation to crime statistics, debt peonage, labor market exclusion, rent harvesting, heightened toxic exposure, infrastructure deprivation, and spatial isolation, usurious credit terms, and financial predation, the racial differentiation thought to be extrinsic to capitalism since the end of slavery has in fact been both directly productive of value and integral to the technical development of capitalism, where new specializations in violence are field-tested, free from ethical judgment, setting off new rounds in which people separated from land, resources, and social bonds can be consumed in the interests of capital accumulation. Marx recognizes that capital is built not only on its contradiction with exploited labor, but also in a contradictory relationship to life itself. Capital accumulation spurs population increase and also voraciously depletes living labor. The constant violent dislocation of these two processes requires constant management in the form of police and military solutions, that is, directly coercive interventions. It spurs forms of moral, temporal, and spatial sequestration that become part of the framework of crisis management, through which the simultaneous production of growth and death can be viewed less as a contradiction than as a necessary dimension of historical progress. Racism's toxicity in this view is a byproduct of capitalist abstraction and a material event. It is as much our inheritance as is the environmental degradation resulting from capitalism's appropriation of cheap nature. The relationship of capitalism and slavery is in this way far-reaching. By exposing both the heterogeneity and the proximity of violence and economy, it also reveals the broken time of politics and strategy. Rather than a disorientation, it is a starting point for any reconstruction of anti-capitalist politics. So I tried to end with a sort of flourish there. That's sort of the purpose, to kind of come back to where I started, of kind of why I became interested in trying to re-enter this conversation and try to think about what a more productive and kind of generous from both sides, really, dialogue between kind of Marxism and black radicalism might look like, recognizing in some ways that Marx himself might be thought of as a black Marxist in a certain sense, recognizing that a figure like Douglass, who's actually really telling us something about slavery through the idioms of social death, which have become so important to kind of thinking about kind of the history of kind of racial violence, is also centrally concerned with questions of labor and value creation. And that really there is a kind of open text here for our consideration that really, again, should be really at the center of how we think about anti-capitalist politics today. So I'll stop there. Comments, questions, counter-proposals, polemics.
I'll be the first to ask a question. It's interesting to me, sort of the relationship that you're building between capital and labor in these historical contexts. And I guess my question is, sort of the racial component we've seen replicated, right? Like even here in Seattle with the, or here on the West Coast, we've seen the same thing happen with the Chinese immigrants, right? Where, you had the Knights of Labor destroy and maim and murder thousands of people here on the port in the same context, right? They're taking our jobs, they're taking our livelihoods. There's this competition among workers. And I wonder, before that, if we go back a little further, before democracy, before capitalism itself, we're thinking about power. And when it was monarchical, or when it was, serfs and lords and all that kind of thing, has this, like you were saying, race is an abstraction of power, right? So that we can use other people against each other. Did that abstraction exist before, or was that abstraction created as a result of capitalism? Capitalism being just another form of, what we would say, monarchy or oligarchy or something like that. Is this just a further abstraction? Like we went from, well, the king is the boss, to now, like, our boss is our boss, but we should hate these people. Did that exist before? I wonder if this is just a continuing thought.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's a very good question, and it's, as I sort of indicated in my comments, it's one I sort of try to kind of just remain agnostic about to some degree. There's the other epigraph to this essay, which I won't read you because it's very long. It's from the Grundrisse. Marx is talking about the relationship between an undeveloped system of exchange, so pre-capitalist, and capitalism. And what he says is, it's very interesting, he says, in the undeveloped system of exchange, the relationships appear to be more personal. People seem imprisoned in a certain definition: feudal lord and vassal, landlord and serf, members of a caste, members of an estate. And in the money relation, people are freed from these into kind of abstract, right, individuality, right? And he seems to be posing the relationship of one where kind of ascriptive hierarchy, right, we might call it, just to sort of use a placeholder. Again, it's kind of an abstraction, but the sort of the relations in which people feel themselves to be part of natural groupings, right, are kind of being broken up and left behind, and people are being kind of freed, right, to be individuals selling their labor on the marketplace. And he goes on to basically say this is an illusory freedom. He says, in fact, it is more like indifference. The definedness of individuals in the former case appears like a personal restriction of liberty, like a kind of domination. And in the latter case, it appears as an objective restriction, like by the marketplace. So nobody's really dominated. It's like, this is what capitalism does. It frees us, but what it really does is it frees us to be kind of equally unfree in a certain sense, right? So Marx is really trying to grapple with that. But what I try to say in this is that the positing, and a lot of kind of liberal social contract theory, I think, essentially takes up the sort of idea that ascriptive hierarchy is kind of pre-modern, and maybe it gets carried over, right, in the ways we are not yet modern. But in every other sense, liberalism is about the sort of constructedness of our the social constructedness of our relationships, right? There's nothing natural about them. There's no way in which we're embedded in kind of pre-existing hierarchies that have some kind of claim on us outside of the ways in which they have been created or chosen, right? In some sense. But I guess I want to say something slightly different about what race is. That race isn't just a kind of hangover of a kind of pre-capitalist ascriptive hierarchy. That it actually is something new, that it is a new kind of fabrication of a kind of coercive relationship in the shadow of kind of formal freedom, right? So it's not enough to just sort of think about race as something that sort of carries over from a past. And this is the way people like to talk about it. Like liberals like Amy Chua, who has a new book out, she's like one of the banes of my existence when I read her work. It's like, the new tribalism, like we're all like tribal all of a sudden. And they love to use words like tribal, because liberal modernity is supposedly always leaving behind like tribalism, right? Because before there were people, basically it was the war of all against all, and then we sort of entered into this the kind of civilizing process sort of brought about through long distance trade, exchange, production. And Marx has some of that, right? Marx is kind of understanding a civilizing process that comes about through the ways in which market dependency becomes generalized, right, and the ways in which the accumulation process works. He just sees the violence that is intrinsic and imminent within that process, and he also sees it as a process that is crisis ridden. That it actually does. It's not a smooth surface. So what I guess I'm trying to say is that what we need to develop is an account of race within the history of capitalism. Not necessarily giving a kind of a definitive answer to your question about what comes before. I guess my suspicion would be that that sort of race war is, in some sense, pre-capitalist, right? But that just like capitalism itself is not ever something that marks a definitive break from the feudal past. Right, that there isn't a kind of a moment in which everything sort of shifts, and that's where I think the search for origins just kind of starts to sort of trip us up. But there is a kind of way that rather than race being something static, and this is I guess something I want to insist upon, we actually need to see it as a sort of a dynamic fabrication. Otherwise, it wouldn't be so continuously reinvested in. Right, and this is where the sort of creativity of race making is something that I think is important, and by creativity, I'm using it in a non-normative way, right? I'm not saying it's a good creation, but it is creative in the sense that it, and in some ways maybe because Assad asked this question last night, what is race? Maybe this way of thinking gets us away from a language of race altogether at some point. It forces us to actually start to think about, race making or certain kinds of processes that are about, almost like a kind of a doubling within our systems, like a dual system of law, a dual system of infrastructure, we live in a system of a kind of racial dualism, right? I mean, it's obviously it's more than that because race itself or racialization is heterogeneous. But as you say, different groups and people can kind of be plugged in. They can be plugged in as the people who will be, whose rights will not be protected, who are kind of deemed to be outside of any community that needs to be valued, who are able to be sort of experimented on in certain kinds of ways. who can be the locus of a kind of a sanctioned fear or a sanctioned violence that sort of bounds this sort of civil relationship for other people, right? So I think maybe this is about me being interested in kind of the nature of what kind of abstraction race actually is, and I think that actually is probably useful for connecting it to the history of capitalism, if that makes any sense. And you might have something you want to say about that, Chandan, because I think I've learned a lot of this particular way of thinking from reading your work, and so in this way, race is something that is kind of a placeholder, like it's an analytical term, kind of like capital, right? It's a term that we actually need to do some work to understand the work that it does. Yeah.
So I have a couple of questions, but I'll limit it to one, which is, what do you think about in the concept of fetishism of commodities, that capital, as it develops, there is a greater and greater tendency for us to look upon one another as commodities, as that we're all commodities, commodification is the kind of the essence of what capitalism is doing in the marketplace,
yeah.
etc. And so that to whatever extent forms of oppression through either race or gender or whatever, or whatever that may have occurred in antiquity, under capitalism, it is easier to move in that direction because everything is turned into a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And everything is, to call something chattel at that point is just a smooth transition. I'm wondering what you think about that and influence that capitalism has because of its dependency on the market.
I think that's a great point, and I think you're exactly right. And I think it's a very helpful supplement to a lot of the sort of kinds of arguments I'm making here. King called it thingification. Martin Luther King called it thingification. And I think that is something where we again can sort of take from the history of slavery and anti-slavery thinking to think about what it meant for human beings to be commodities at the same time you have the production of commodities. And to kind of see how, in a way now, especially where the sort of self-commodification is so radically sort of deepened and accelerated into every part of our lives, how that legacy of kind of the market in people, or people as a commodity is so central to the history of capitalism. And one of the best books that I've ever read about this, some of you probably read it, is Walter Johnson's Soul by Soul, where he really makes the argument, if I'm remembering correctly, that the slave market, which is the site of valuation, and Douglas uses that term in his narrative. He talks about we were all assembled for the valuation, right? And he's basically talking about slaves being brought out to be sold. Johnson has these very meticulous descriptions of the New Orleans slave market, where the buyers are coming and they're looking at these slaves, and they're sort of they're looking inside their mouths, and they're examining their skin tone, and they're seeing how strong their muscles are, and the slaves themselves who are for auction are also assessing the masters, like trying to think, is this going to be a good situation for me? Is this going to be a dangerous situation for me? Do I want to look sullen for this person? Do I want to look, like I might be docile and cooperative for this person who I want to buy me? So Johnson's also sort of thinking about that even under these really austere conditions of being sold, that people have certain kinds of agents, because people are people, right? So they're agents of under tremendous constraints. So, but what's really interesting about that part of the book, as I remember it, is he's really kind of thinking about how this is the sort of the beginning of people kind of developing a sort of vernacular way, a kind of modes of racial valuation, modes of assessing kind of the meaning of skin, the meaning of hair, the meaning of sort of the black body itself, and what it's supposed to yield, what kinds of values and propensities and capacities it has. So that is so clearly like a deep part of the history of capitalism and of American capitalism, certainly. that I think connecting that with the discussion around the fetishism of commodities is extremely valuable. So I think it's a nice line of thinking to follow.
Thank you first. This is a really, really compelling argument you're making. It's been a while since I've read the narrative, but in that section, is that in Baltimore?
Yeah, that's right.
So he's actually still enslaved.
He is. He
right?
is. Yeah.
So how does that sort of, and I think it actually, that detail kind of intensifies the argument you're making insofar as particularly that differentiation that Douglas makes between the purchase of labor power and the purchase of life, such that his life is simultaneously understood as property, but then his labor power is itself sort of alienatable, even though he gets a sort of slight portion of that, right?
Right.
So how would that kind of thing, taking that into account, affect the way you think about the sort of, I don't want to say transitional, but processual, not procedure, but the fact that capital and its relation to so-called primitive accumulation is in fact a process, right? That it is a sort of a meshing gear within the internal workings of capital, such that it has to continuously toss out, take in, toss out, take in. So does sort of looking at that technology of labor in that moment help us think about something like, say, guest worker programs currently, and sort of the way that that notion that this is a anachronistic process kind of does that sort of build into the argument you're making about the place of so-called primitive accumulation within the workings of capital?
Yeah, I think you sort of framed it as a question, but I think you made a really I think you made a really excellent comment. I don't read it as close, the passage as closely as you just did. I think it's really interesting to kind of pick up on that point. But I think the point really is that there's another passage that I quote in the text where Marx says something like, this is before Capital, though. This is when Marx is still what Gopal Balakrishnan calls an abolitionist. He says, and I mean he's always an abolitionist, but he's a sort of a more forthright sort of thinking about slavery. And he said, slavery only appears as an anomaly opposite the bourgeois system, right? So, I mean, that's just a fascinating, I think that's almost exactly the right quote, appears as an anomaly, right? So, and then there are times when it's just an anomaly. Like, so the appearance part the gap closes, and I think in a certain kind of Eurocentric Marxist reading of Marx, you get slavery and capitalism, or slavery and wage work as kind of opposites, right? And I think Marx is always sort of attuned to how that's not always, but I think in this sort of mesh, or this process we're talking about, there's an attunement in Douglas and Marx to the way in which there isn't a kind of an absolute differentiation, right? And I think the other person whose work, and I wouldn't say that I fully, absorbed the book, but and maybe have you had Jason Moore here for Red May?
Not yet.
No, you should. Yeah, that'd be great to have him.
Yeah.
His book Capitalism and the Web of Life, which is really kind of about Marx's ecological thought, and I think the sort of the basic argument that he's making in that book is really about the relationship between exploitation and dispossession, and that which is sort of similar, right? Which is that there's an ongoing sort of dynamic. It's obviously not that dispossession happens once and then accumulation takes off. I mean, I think we've all sort of grasped that now, and David Harvey's made that point. Many other people have made that point. But I think Moore is making a sort of even a deeper, more profound argument that what he calls the kind of ability to access what he calls the four cheaps, sort of cheap nature, cheap labor, cheap raw materials, cheap energy. Or cheap food, cheap energy, cheap raw materials, cheap labor. That the capacity to draw in the cheapness of these things into the machinery of accumulation, right, is like part of an ongoing dynamic of capitalism itself, right, and that it involves a frontier logic where coercion and dispossession are and sort of state violence and state power are kind of the agencies, like they're at the forefront of that kind of process. So in that way, right, and then of course the ways in which that's not, the frontier is not just over there, right? The frontier is also, in the central district, or now it's not even the central district, right? It's wherever the next place is, right? The frontier is always somewhere, where the sort of the mobilization of kind of the policing apparatus is actually central to the next moment of the sort of creation of a valuation that is sort of inside the boundary of what is considered to be normative capitalism, right? So there's something about that process that I think, is sort of so extensively developed and also intensively developed as part of the logic of capitalism that I think a lot of different kinds of contemporary theoretical and political thought is actually trying to map and think about, and I think that this is the sort of what you point to in sort of thinking about the kind of the guest worker or the various kinds of status differentiations or differentiations within the sort of the kind of laboring body itself. Prison labor. All kinds of different sorts of labor, that exist.
The slave beast, the convict.
Yeah, the convict. Labor is heterogeneous, right? Labor is heterogeneous. So, I think that's the point, right?
So, I have a Marx birthday thought about the whole chapter that I'll save for the end, but I just have a simple informational thing. Mm-hmm. If someone, either Chandon or Assad or you, could tell me or us a little about Bacon's rebellion. I think I read a little bit about it in some work, and the notion that we've all thought for many years that the primal nightmare was Nat Turner, the notion of a black rebellion. But the nightmare here seems to be that poor white workers and black people will get together and destroy capitalism or something like that. I don't know anything about the circumstances of it, and I wonder if just someone could elaborate.
You write about Ted Allen, right, in your book,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Go for it. I've been talking too much.
Well, I want to situate it in a comment about something that came up before, which I think is very important, and I think you've addressed in a way that I agree with, which is this chicken-egg thing, and the question about whether we can talk about race prior to the history of capitalism. Well, this is a fundamental question methodologically for Marx regarding other categories. Mm-hmm. So, money. Mm-hmm. Capitalism is about the accumulation of wealth in the abstract form of money. But go into a museum and you will see coins from thousands of years before there was capitalism.
Right.
All of these relations existed before capitalism, and then they were reconfigured in a particular way within the capitalist mode of production. And in the Grundrisse, he's tackling this question, which is, how do we take these forms which exist in capitalist society in a particular way and then trace their connection to what seems to be the same form in an entirely different kind of social formation, entirely different mode of production. And it even goes to the very concept of labor. Mm-hmm. So and now there are two senses in the Grundrisse, and especially in the 1857 introduction.
There are more than two senses.
There are at least two senses in which we can talk about abstract labor. And one is the fact that, let's say, the horizontal fact that in capitalist society, different kinds of concrete labors are rendered equivalent in the form of value. But then there's another vertical abstraction historically, which is to say, how is it that in previous forms of society, activities that people did not recognize as labor, as something that was equivalent to what everybody else was doing, how can we call that labor? Mm-hmm. That's a fundamental methodological problem. Now, in his earlier works, from German ideology up through the Communist Manifesto and various scatterings here and there, he wants to present a theory of all of history. And so he can talk about how these categories transform historically. But then after his work on the Grundrisse, and by the time he gets to Capital Volume 1, he decides, I'm not going to present a theory of all of history. I'm going to present a theory of the capitalist mode of production and of its contradictory origins with primitive accumulation. And I'm not going to talk about it as a moment in a trans-historical dynamic. Mm-hmm. I think that's the kind of logic that when I talk about race and the question of what is race, I want to do something similar methodologically. We can look and find descriptive hierarchies and group differentiations preceding capitalist society, but are the Inquisition and the Crusades examples of race? Mm-hmm. I mean, is it useful to describe those in terms of race? Or do we need to have many different categories and to understand the heterogeneity of these ascriptive hierarchies and group differentiations? So I think that that's why the Ted Allen idea of looking at Bacon's Rebellion, and fundamentally what's important to me about the analysis of Bacon's Rebellion by Ted Allen is that it's the source of the invention of the white race. Mm-hmm. And the invention of the white race is the point at which I think that the race concept in capitalist society emerges. And that's historically specific. So that's my comment on that.
Did you want to jump in?
Oh.
You don't have to.
Do people know what Bacon's Rebellion is?
That's what I was
Yeah.
just talking
Yeah.
Well, so maybe that would just be useful.
Yeah.
Is just to mention what it is. So it's a rebellion that happens in the 17th century, I think in like 1670s. And it's a rebellion led by, what's Bacon's first name? Nathaniel?
Yeah.
Nathaniel Bacon. And it's spurred because of discontent that Nathaniel Bacon has with the British governor's policies in the location, Berkeley, I think, and part of it was that Nathaniel Bacon and his cohort were being prevented from trading with the can't remember the name of the indigenous. You probably know.
I don't either.
But anyway, prevented from trading with the participating in the fur trade, and it was a multiracial rebellion against these policies, and it was what spurs, in some people's account, David Roediger has a really nice account of this in How Race Survived U.S. History, where in some people's account, it's the rebellion that starts to spur the tactic of divide and conquer logics among governing groups in the Americas and North America. So there start to become differentiations between white and black settlers. There start to be differentiations about what kinds of penalties people are going to receive. But I think one of the most important parts about the Bacon's Rebellion that's useful in this story is that it was also about trying to, Nikhil talked at the end about population, it was also about trying to make sure that settlers didn't go into the so-called hinterlands, go into the forest and into the commons, as it were, because then you couldn't have the system of production of settler society as well. So it was also a tactic of using indigenous treaties to create settler society, right? So in other words, Berkeley and them partly made treaties with these indigenous peoples because they wanted to make sure that white settlers didn't go and set up shop someplace else. They needed to also make sure that there wasn't an expansion of settlement that was autonomous, but rather was being controlled by the crown. And so part of this is also a story of how treaty making, as much as it looked like something that was about, maybe a moment in which there was some acknowledgement of indigenous territory, was actually also a tactic of producing a society, an enclosed society in North America as well. So they can, I think
that's great.
A lot of different angles on, it's not just a labor rebellion, it's also about what it means to create a settler society.
And I just want to say, if you want to learn about it, read the Barbara Fields and Karen Fields book, Racecraft. And especially the essay Slavery and Ideology, slavery, race, and ideology in the United States of America?
Yeah.
That's the thing.
It's a classic, yeah.
Oh, I also wanted to just follow up with what Hassan was saying about that question about these descriptive hierarchies and concepts of race that precede, capitalism as we think of it developing in North America. I mean, just if you were to look at Spanish colonial settlement of the Americas, there's all of these distinct kind of concepts of race, so-called casta, and the famous casta paintings, and very, notorious kind of hierarchalizations of mixed blood and all this kind of stuff. And so it's obviously got its sort of Catholic ideology, I guess, in some ways, that kind of race thinking. And it kind of persists to a certain degree in Latin America even now, though it's been itself transformed ideologically by the extension and growth of capitalism in those contexts in a more proper sense. So, so I think that's another example, like how you were talking about this like Inquisition and these earlier hierarchies and kind of how there's something to, are they race in the way that we think of how capitalism has transformed that kind of thinking, and then in Latin America, it's just another example of that. It's something we talked about. I remember Charlie Post came to Santa Cruz, where Hassan and I live, and presented his book, The American Road to Capitalism, book that people may know from Historical Materialism. Did it, I think, the first version of it, and so he has like a kind of story of race and racism in that book too, and he's a real partisan, like I am, of the Fields argument. But I remember also talking with Charlie. We had a discussion about this too, like the kind of way in which race had its distinct articulation in Spanish colonial contexts. And it'd be reductive to say, like, it's the same as race in North America, but then somehow it does get transformed too, and as capitalism spreads in this more proper sense into,
well, just like
elsewhere and what. So that's a good way of thinking about it. I like what Hassan was saying there. But yeah, go ahead.
I mean, these are all really excellent comments, and I'll just add to them really with just a couple of points. I mean, there is a big comparative and history of race making to be written, not by one person, and that has been obviously written by many people in the Spanish, in the French, in the German, in the North American, in the English speaking world, in the English settler colonial world. And I think, there's like a varieties of capitalism literature too that is, you could say is also, somewhat, we could find significant, valuable differences in the way in which we think about the ways in which different colonial capitalist projects sort of developed historically. I do think that there's some things that are very important. One would be the sort of the biologization of race, in the 18th century, especially the kind of attachment to a certain kind of naturalistic account of the body and embodiment, and I think it's very importantly related to arguments about reproduction, and I think this is an argument that the historian Jennifer Morgan, who's my colleague in New York City, has made and has a really fantastic book coming out. And she's not the first person to make it, but she argues that the first race making law really is the law of partus sequitur ventrum, which is the issue follows the womb, and it is the law that really basically sort of says that this is how we're going to know what a slave is. A slave is the issue of the female slave. And of course it becomes racialized, but it's legally kind of defined, and it obviously sanctions kind of rape and sexual violence, and it sanctions a kind of approach to the production of human commodities that is actually an active part of the ways in which American slavery or North American slavery is going to outlast the outlawing of the slave trade and so forth. So it's a hugely important part of this. And the other thing that I would say is that the other law that comes right after Bacon's Rebellion, these are both laws passed in the Virginia colonies in the late 17th century. The other law is, as Pachandan was alluding to, laws about punishment. So and Edmund Morgan sort of made this case, long ago that who was Barbara Field's, teacher, I guess. I think he was maybe her advisor. I can't remember, but that white servants would be protected with clothing when they were whipped, and that was a so like everyone all workers are being whipped, but to be white meant that you got to keep your clothing while you're being whipped. And I always found that to be a really interesting moment in the history of whiteness, because it kind of both says something about how shabby and shoddy whiteness is as a kind of inheritance in some ways. Or even a kind of privilege, really, a privilege to be whipped with your clothes on as opposed to be stripped. Of course, that's elaborated into something else, but it says something about a kind of punitive logic, a kind of threat, And I think this is a valuable part of the history of whiteness to recover, not to sort of tell white people that they are oppressed too, or to sort of eliminate any kind of notion of kind of thinking about how racial differentiation has mattered in the differentiation of the fates of people in the world, but really to kind of pull us out of the way in which the discourse of white privilege is now framed, because this is a really different genealogy of that kind of concept, right? So it all stems from Bacon's Rebellion. It does stem from the kind of terror, that there might be the uprising of the sort of the motley crew, as Radiker and Linebaugh talk about.
Yeah, it's many-headed Hydra.
That's
also
right.
That has that discussion of Bacon's Rebellion.
Yeah.
I want to go back to what Assad said, since he actually did my Marxist birthday for talk.
I told you there are people who know Marx better than I do here.
And I did how to use the Primitive Accumulation chapter, which is obviously something that's been looked at from a lot of angles.
Yeah.
If you ask someone to talk about something from Marx, 80% of the people offer that as their first choice. It's very hard to do.
That's interesting.
But it's a really subtle chapter. I mean, it has so many strands in it that can be picked up and have been picked up. First of all, it's so-called primitive accumulation, which is a very important notion.
Right.
And some people say, well, an original accumulation is better. And first, it's a kind of deconstruction of Adam Smith's tale that the origin of capitalism is a bunch of people who just saved their money and didn't go out and spend it in riotous living, and the riotous livers spent all theirs, but that's why certain people have money.
The frugal elite.
That's the origin of capitalism, frugality. And that's ridiculous for a number of reasons. The obvious one is the one that comes from anybody who's involved in any kind of post-colonial studies understands that there was a great deal of blood, as Marx said, that was spread all over the world in order for capitalism to happen. So that makes the story ridiculous. But the other thing that makes it ridiculous is the notion that if you just heap money up into piles, when you get to a certain amount, you have capitalism. No, you don't. You have a hoard. You have plunder. Plunder has gone on from the beginning of time to the present. So what is it that makes capitalism? And I think, as Assad said, all of these things have been around. Money, credit, in Italian banks, and so forth. But they come together at one moment of various things, and they take. And I find that Althusser's vision of that happening, as kind of explained by Jason Reed in the Micropolitics of Capital, that these things could have hit one another and not stuck together, following that image of the rain, but they did, and suddenly something new emerges. That's a whole new system, accumulation system. And I like the way Assad also applies that for the elements of the race idea as they're put up in the moment. Now, it's clear that the history in that chapter is what was called potted history, I guess. It's very spare, and it needs to be amplified. And particularly the implication behind it that we're all headed to a destination once we found this new form of slavery, wage slavery, and all this other stuff disappears. And yet it's clear, as we look at how capitalism has evolved in this century, we're watching it with the perspective of people who are in a horror movie and discover that the monster that they thought they had analyzed that could do this and this and this has 100 other ways of surviving, so you've got to think of better ways to kill it. Who would have thought that all the forms of indentured servitude or slavery would come back at the end of the production chain around the world,
right,
as it has? And the idea of formal subsumption rather than, and then leading to real subsumption, the notion that you could start with a putting out system, but then take all those cottages and put them on the floor of the factory because capital wants to have everything under its control, doesn't foresee how convenient it is to have the supplier, have no connection with the supplier, so that whenever they commit environmental or labor crimes, you're not involved, you're not implicated as Benetton for the people who make the factory the injury. So the fact that all of these things came back as viable forms of accumulation means that we, as the collective Marx, working with that sort of model that he came up with, not of all of human history, but a model of capitalism, how it works, will do what Marx himself would have done had he seen all these things, which is continually expand our notion of it and postpone writing our volume for another 10 years till we figure out how it worked. Mm-hmm. So I think in that case, all the reintegration of race and forms of slavery and all the other, and what's happening to labor in the world is a real challenge to come up with an adequate theory of how capital functions. And I think that's the challenge that this chapter lays out, that it couldn't address in the 19th century because it hasn't really seen all of the things that we've seen now. So that was just one.
Isn't some of this about sort of how you look at that chapter, right? Whether you see it as whether you see it as a historical chapter, a historization, or a logical argument. It strikes me that it's so-called primitive accumulation is logically prior. It's not necessarily historically prior. And if you read it that way, I mean, you could be so perverse and say the old man got it right from the start, and it's just a matter of continuing to rigorously apply that logic. And thus, right, I mean, the so oft remarked phrase of market making, right? Market making is itself a sort of logical, you have to make the market before it can become capital, right? So it generates this process by which that which was previously not enclosed becomes enclosed, often by taking it from one enclosure, casting it out, and then bringing it back in. I don't know if anybody's seen The Big Short, right? But I think this points us also to the role of the state and how the state functions. I feel like the state is in many ways the motor for this sort of logic, because it's precisely the distinctions that the state makes, especially in terms of its the liberal state's use of so-called negative rights, right? So it becomes a way by which, if you've seen The Big Short or read it, right? There's this moment where the Christian Bale character, right, who's the sort of savant hero, decides that he needs to invent a new market to invent the shorting, basically, right? And so what he has to do is lobby to get the SEC to open it up for him. So that kind of points us to the way in which the state has to intervene to produce the enclosure that capital then can logically take back in and generate again. Does that make sense?
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
You guys want to break up and have like a talk about?
Yeah, sure. I think we've had a good, rich conversation, so that would be great. Let's hang around and chat.
Yeah.
Thank you so much.